Okay, this is just a little explanatory video on this particular article I'm having you read this week, titled Temperatures in Pre-dynastic Egypt Inferred from the Remains of the Nile Perch. And you've got all the bibliographic information there. Now, this is something I talked about in a lecture for this week, so this shouldn't be new. But since I've asked you to read this article, I'd like to go through it with you. Now, this particular article doesn't have an abstract. So if you remember, read the abstract and introduction and then conclusion, and then come back and read the entire article. This doesn't have an abstract, but the introduction sort of serves as the abstract. So if you read through that, it starts off talking about the rise of complex society in Egypt and how most of the information we have is archaeological and without too much more. And so what the article is going to look at is fish and what that can tell us about temperatures and what can then we can guess about agriculture. There are figures in this particular article, and I'll look at figure 1 in just a minute. And what it does is it shows environmental changes and cultural changes, meaning like pre-dynastic, early dynastic periods. And then it talks about how by this period, Egyptians were dependent on agriculture, which means that they live in one area, and we talked about that before, which leads to population growth. And it talks about some of the animals and plants that they are growing. Around 3800, you get Nile floods reducing in their size. And we've talked about this before. If the Nile isn't flooding, then you get less agriculture. With less agriculture, that leads to other issues like people not having enough food, and then what do they do in that particular case? It was also drier in that period, so those two are definitely related. Drier or aridity and reduction of Nile floods are definitely the same. Okay, figure 1. Now, I'm hoping you can see my little mouse here. So this is the time scale. So 7,000 years before present. You can see the BP here. And then it gives you, luckily, it gives you the BC. So I'm going to just concentrate on the BC, and this is on the right side of this graph. Now what you need to do is look at this thing in entirety. There are 3 different things happening here. One is just the general time scale, and that shows you like the wet period. It's got little waves here. A clear period is dry, and then you've got a moisture period, dry, moist, and then dry. Now, looking over next to this, you also have a graph of the Nile. So when the Nile gets high, you can see is during the wet period. And no big surprise, you have this dry period. And look, you have a dip in the Nile, the height of the Nile floods. And then you have a moist period where it goes up again. And then you get drier. And you can see these little dots. So they're not quite sure what's happening with the height of the Nile flood. But during this dry period, you get a dip, and then it goes back up. And then move over further to the right. Here is where you have the cultural part of this particular graph. So around, let's see, it must be around 5,500 BC is when the Neolithic started. And then we're talking about the pre-dynastic period. So we're talking about 4,700. And it gives you the early, middle, late. And of course, it gives you the Naqada period, which we've talked about. We've talked about Hierakonpolis, and so on. And then we'll be talking about the early dynastic period in just a bit, around 3000 BC. So that's how you read this. So you've got that, what they call the paleoclimate. You've got the Nile flooding and the heights, and then you've got the cultural things that are happening in Egypt. And it also says that because it's drier, you get less rain, but temperature also plays an important part in the amount of rain you would actually get. And then it gets to the gist of the article. You can look at vertebrae of these Nile perch to look at growth rings. And what they've done is they've looked at Hierakonpolis, where there's been lots of fish bones dug up. So people are eating fish, and then they're looking at that. Then the article looks at data collection, and it shows you a map of where Hierakonpolis is. And I talked about this before in the lecture. We know that these fish are dated to this period because of ceramics. And you remember what seriation is where you use pottery or ceramics to date something. And then he talks a little bit about what's happening with the perch. And he says that, temperature is considered to be the principal factor regarding growth. So the warmer it gets, the more they grow. The colder it gets, the slower the growth. And I talked about this in the lecture. And then it talks about the material and methods. So I've shown you this in the lecture, how you can see these little growth rings. And I'm just going to skip down. And I talked a bit about these charts in the lecture, so I'm not going to go over that material again. So if you go down to the analysis results, it looks like air temperature can be correlated to water temperature, which is nice for the Nile. This doesn't happen in all rivers or in all lakes, but it does in the Nile. So what happens with these fish bones, these growth rings tell us about the temperature of the water. They also tell us about the temperature of the air, which of course can tell us about if it's colder, there's less agriculture. If it's warmer, there may be more agriculture. I talked about these charts in the lecture, so I'm not going to talk about them again. And then he gets down to discussion about what's happening in Egypt right now, as opposed to what was happening in the past. And then you get down to the conclusion. So it states here that evidence of these Nile perch growth rings during the Naqada II period, that there were increased variability in winter temperatures. So increased temperature variability can mean, especially if it's low temperatures, low rainfall. And then that can tell you a little bit about what's happening in terms of agriculture. So it says winter rains are an important feature leading to the productivity of the desert margins, especially where grazing animals were. So if you get less winter rain, you might have less area to feed your cattle, for example. And then it talks about the connections again with the environmental conditions, with decreasing floods, it getting drier, and then that leads to variability in winter temperatures. And so this entire article is really about sustainability, where it links in weather with agriculture and all tied into these fish bones.